introduction to myself, I'm Helen Channer and I'm a Senior Manager in Parry's VAT Advisory team. Been with the business about 5 years now, and before that worked in the Big Four and one of the law firms. So one of my areas of specialism is the not-for-profit sector and education space, and so I regularly get rolled out to these kind of events to share my pearls of wisdom. So since our last event, which I believe was September last year, I wouldn't say we've particularly had many significant VAT changes or developments that have made things different from what's been the case for the last few years from a VAT space. But as ever, it remains a very complicated and complex area. So what I've decided to structure my session today around are commonly asked questions, or FAQs, things that I see coming up on a fairly regular basis, or typical pinch points where it's not necessarily always that clear on how academies should be reporting their VAT. Now, the answers I'll give clearly only scratch the surface. That's a very fact-specific and a question where you need to understand the context of a particular academy. But hopefully it'll give you some food for thought and suggestions around what you may or may not be getting quite right within the academy. So start with a couple of just starting questions. I don't know if anybody in the room here is a recent converter or is maybe on the process to becoming academy from local authority control. But a basic question we sometimes see is, we're about to convert to an academy and previously we never really needed to handle our own VAT affairs. Why is it different once we become an academy? And the answer to that effectively is that when you're part of a local authority, you are part and parcel of the local authority's own VAT affairs and their single VAT registration. So typically the local authority would take primary responsibility for pulling the VAT together, pulling the VAT return together, and the local authority schools were more, they just had the role of making sure the data was being fed through and that the local authority would run the show on the decision making. Once you become an academy, you are treated as your own entity for VAT purposes. Whether that's a multi-school basis where they would all sit within the same trust head or a single school. And although the VAT legislation is drafted to broadly put you in the same position that local authority schools are under, you are responsible for your own VAT treatment. So understanding your VAT returns, whether you actually need to be registered at all, whether you can use 126 claims, the decision making around what gets charged to VAT, what isn't, what's treated as VAT exempt, all sits within the trust's own remit and responsibility. So for converter schools, that can be quite a baptism of fire if they've never had that responsibility before. Equally, we may then get the question, well, if we're now an academy school, how do we go about recovering the VAT on our costs once we're an academy? So there's two ways of doing this, and depending on your circumstances, you might be eligible to do either. You might be forced down one particular route, so it depends exactly on what your own context and operational setup is. So the first thing to bear in mind is that the education you provide to the students is generally seen as non-business activity. You're providing it under an obligation to the state and it's grant funded in nature. Now, for those of you who've ever worked outside of the schools and academy sector, normally the phrase non-business and VAT don't go together overly well, because it would mean, well, we can't recover input tax on non-business costs. Because of that special legislation I mentioned that tries to put you in the same position as local authorities, you have this extra rule that says that academies can recover input tax as long as it relates to non-business expenditure and the non-business activity of teaching the pupils for free. So to make that refund claim, you can either do it through being non-VAT registered and the Form 126 method. This should cover the majority of your expenditure, but not necessarily all of it, because if you're still non-registered but do have some small pockets of business income, which I'll come to later with some examples of what that business income may be, you are still supposed to perform an apportionment within your 126 claims to restrict, to some extent, how much input tax you're recovering. The alternative is that if you have registered for that, either on a voluntary basis or because you are compulsorily registrable, i.e. you do have taxable business turnover above the 90,000 threshold, then you have to submit your VAT recovery claims through your return. obviously at the same time as accounting for the appropriate output tax as necessary on whatever business and taxable income you have. Now, I've mentioned taxable business activities a few times, and not all academies I see have a full level of understanding of exactly which things would make them business and taxable income. So common ones we see would be sale of books within the school, but these would be zero rated. Zero rating is obviously a particularly beneficial tax treatment, because from the point of view of the sales, you don't have to add that on, but it gives an entitlement to recovery. Uniforms, sometimes we see these being questioned around, well, do we get the zero rating or not? Do we have to standard rate these? Generally, if the uniform is being targeted at the under 14 age range, then it can be zero rated, but then anything above will be standard rated. I've seen questions around things like ties, which are not necessarily always size based, or at least you might get a primary size tie and a secondary size tie, but then you fall into a grey area of, well, where are we going to categorise this? So it's not always black and white. Sales of food and catering to staff and visitors. I think this is fairly commonly missed, and I don't always see schools tracking this. So in the following slide, I'll mention what happens when you sell the food to the actual pupils at the school. But staff and visitors, that is business income. So you should be monitoring how much of that is being generated, and that will top up towards your taxable turnover threshold. If you become registrable and then have registered for that, you do need to be accounting for 20% on those meals to your visitors. Certain lettings of sports facilities can be taxable by default. There are some exemptions to this, which are on the following slide, but sports facilities are a particularly complex area. A lot of the questions that we get relate to letting activity, and often the starting point is, well, exactly what is it that you're letting? Is it a classroom? Is it a sports facility? Is it the building as a whole? And having the context and the understanding from where the questions may be coming from, sometimes the finance team like yourselves just get told, oh, we're about to start doing this, what do we do? Well, you need to make sure that you're being given a very thorough explanation from your various colleagues as to what that letting actually is going to look like. Now, in terms of VAT exempt business activities, these also need to be monitored, not necessarily from the point of view of understanding your registration threshold, because VAT exempt income doesn't count towards that, but it's part of what I was saying about the right to recover input VAT through these special rules on your non-business activity. But if you have got business activity, even if particularly is VAT exempt, that should be taken into account in your partial exemption. So again, having an understanding of exactly the categorisation of your various different pockets of income is important. So I'm just skipping on the previous slide, around lettings of certain space where the Academy has exercised an option for tax is standard rated and taxable. But if you're letting classroom or general space, not sports space, where you've not exercised the options tax, then that is VAT exempt income. Sports facilities, again, I said on the previous slide, this is often taxable, but the exemptions which are quite commonly met within your space are the block booking conditions. So in brief, these are where you have 10 bookings or more being agreed as part of a block booking, and where the nature of the booker is that they are a sports association, a club, or an affiliated body. If you meet all of those requirements, then you can treat that back as being exempt and drop away from the standard rating. So I had a question come up recently, and actually funnily enough in the networking discussions at the start, this kind of was briefly touched on as well. I'm seeing a lot more schools starting to work together in conjunction. So not necessarily schools within the same trust, because you take the same VAT treatment as each other, you're classed as one body. But schools are starting to, for the very good reasons shared by Rebecca and Sharon earlier and Julia, are starting to knowledge share and make sure that the knowledge and advice in the industry has actually been disseminated widely. So some academy trusts are entering into support service agreements with others. Sometimes that's done purely on a free basis. It's treated as let's just get together in a room, talk about what's going on. That's not the kind of activity I'm talking about because there's no income generated there. But in other situations, it may be a more formalised and income-bearing arrangement whereby trust number one is going to be paid for providing some form of support services to a different trust. Now, how might that be treated for that depends on exactly what it is that's been agreed that you are providing. So in some circumstances, that support could be treated as consultancy services or maybe the provision of advice and informational standards that would be subject to VAT and taxable. However, if your support services that have been agreed are more akin to the provision of teachers, HMRC accepts that the supply of teaching staff from one academy to another, or rather one eligible body to another, is education in its own right and VAT exempt. And equally, they accept that that also extends to teaching assistants, so they don't necessarily have to be fully qualified teachers. Further, it might be the case that what has been agreed is that you're providing a formal vocational training course where you're actually, a bit like this, standing in a room and disseminating knowledge rather than sharing ideas. CPD courses or something similar. That would be generally VAT exempt because it's the provision of vocational training by someone who's already an eligible body for VAT purposes. So again, it comes back to that starting question of, if someone says we're about to get some income from support services, your next question needs to be, tell me more. And then once you have that context and background, it should allow you to make a better informed judgment as to whether you should be charging VAT on that extra income or not. So sometimes there are other non-business activities that go on with an academy trust, but where you are generating some form of funds from that. And when I say funds, I mean income as opposed to centralised funding. So the funding that you receive from central government for the teaching of the children is outside the scope of that, and you're not required to account for any output VAT on this. But there are further activities that you may be involved in where there is income generated from doing so, which equally is deemed to be an extension of that general non-business activity of education. The phrase within the sort of VAT legislation is activities that are closely related to education, and if you fall within these are equally outside the scope of VAT. So there's some common examples, which I'll run off in a second, but they are all subject to 3 overriding rules, which I'll explain at the end. So generally the provision of school meals to the pupils of the school or equally visiting pupils. So say you're on an exchange programme and you have some pupils coming in from outside. That can be closely related to education and so VAT exempt. Breakfast and after school clubs, as long as they are being provided by the trust itself. I'm aware that some trusts will have external arrangements where another body is actually brought in to run the breakfast and after school clubs completely independently, and they generate that income. In those situations, that's not your money, so they don't have the ability to use the closely related to education rule, and that isn't outside the scope of VAT. But obviously, it's for that body to take its own views on the VAT taxable treatment. But where the school is in charge of its own breakfast club, even if it's using potentially outside resources to help them manage that, that is also classed as non-business income, and so no VAT needs to be charged on the fees for those clubs. Educational trips, school trips, these again are expected usually to be closely related to education, so the fees that you get from the parents for sending the kids on these trips is outside the scope. And then musical instruments, sorry, the mandatory reboot just popped up on the laptop. I'm allowed to delay that, good. Sorry. Yes, musical instruments which are going to be used by the pupil within school or music lessons. So sometimes just be a little careful around that. We're aware that some schools do use this scheme to help make it a more VAT efficient option. But if this child's, I'm trying to think of something quite out there, they say they want to buy a harp through the school programme, and there's going to be no instances where that instrument gets used actually within school, be careful on that. Now, I said that there are some requirements for all of those examples and wider ones to fall within that non-business treatment. And the requirements are that firstly, the income that you're generating must be either at or below the cost of providing the service. So you can't be looking to generate a profit from what you do. Secondly, the activity must be for the direct benefit of the pupil. Sometimes we see some schools try to extend the non-business rules when they're doing things between two schools or between a third-party private body. That wouldn't qualify. And then thirdly, this kind of links to the point around the use of an instrument within the school. It must be necessary for the delivery of the education to the pupil. So there needs to be some form of link between what is being provided and the benefit accruing to that child, that part and parcel of their education. If you breach any of those three requirements, then it would stop being non-business income, treated as business instead, and then you need to consider, well, is this taxable or is this VAT exempt? Technical difficulty, shall we? I think it might be because of the reboot.
On that?
Yeah, don't know what that was. So I mentioned that if you have got a VAT exempt activity, then you do need to be careful about what impact this actually has on you. So the typical question might be, if we have got business activities which are VAT exempt, does this make it more complicated? And I think probably most of you in the room will be aware, yes, I'm afraid it does, because that would make you partially exempt. So the requirements that then fall on you as a partially exempt organisation is that you have to carry out extra calculations to apportion the VAT that you're incurring between your business activity, where you can reclaim it, and then those costs that relate to the costs that relate to your non-business activity, where you can recover that, and then the cost relating to your business activity, where it then needs to be split out again between your taxable activity and your VAT exempt. There are certain simplifications within partial exemption that can be done. One of the common ones is the de minimis rules. What we sometimes have seen there is businesses that try to shortcut the de minimis. So they say, well, we only have a very small amount of VAT exempt activity, so we think we fall within de minimis, so we're just recovering everything. Unfortunately, it's not that simple. You do still have to run at least part of the partial exemption calculations to be comfortable first that you've qualified, to then give you the right to recover all the VAT. So partial exemption can't be shortcutted really, or at least not in the way that I sometimes see that trying to happen. Catering contracts. In the last 12 months, I've already spoke to a few people in the room and other colleagues and clients around catering income. So catering contracts can be set up in very many different ways, but the two main, the most common ones are firstly, where you have the caterers who act only as the agent at the school, and the school is still acting as the principal in generating the income directly into their own accounts. Here, you are able to use the rules I mentioned earlier about the meals to the pupils benefit from non-business treatment, and so there's no VAT to be accounted for on those meals. The service provided by the caterer to the school of managing the provision of the catering contract would be a taxable supply, and so they would charge you VAT on whatever fees they keep. But usually that can be recovered in full because it predominantly relates to the running of the food provision for the children, which is not business. The alternative most common contract we see is where the caterer has taken a fully outsourced role in the catering, and they are supplying the meal as principal. Because the caterer is not also an educator, it's not part of the Academy Trust, they don't have the ability to use that non-business treatment. So the pupil meals should also have that charged on them in the same way that the staff and visitor meals would. It's really important to understand quite quickly if you're making any changes to your catering provision, whether that's outsourcing it for the first time or switching provider from one to another. You need to be looking at that quite early on to understand, well, is this going to change our obligations and profile? On my final slide, I've got a question here that we've occasionally had raised about saying, well, we heard a lot about making tax digital, the VAT, but we're not VAT registered. We only submit the form 126 claims to get our refunds in that way. Do we need to comply with making tax digital? And I've got some good news for you, which is no. And as it stands, we've not heard anything to suggest that they are looking at extending those rules beyond those people who are fully VAT registered. Unfortunately, for those who are VAT registered, it is something that you very much need to be thinking about. So most of the software provision, Sage, Oracle, similar, they have Making Tax Digital baked into them with the way that you submit the final return to HMRC. The additional layer, which I don't think everybody always fully understands, is that that's only one part of Making Tax Digital. And the other element is that there needs to be a fully digitalised an automated trail through the system. So if there are any manual adjustments made at the end of that VAT return process, that can be a breach of Making Tax Digital. So it's not just as simple as going, well, our finance system handles all that for us. I think that's me on timing, but I will be back at the end for the Q&A. So for now, I will hand over to Glenn for common issues and problems in the